Coffee black. That's all he ever said. Booth 4. Granite face. Loneliness so thick you could taste it. But the day the rain turned biblical, everything twisted. I saw it, a flash of gold beneath that tailored suit when she leaned in. A heart-shaped locket, the kind your grandma owned. Except this one, it was open. Inside a tiny portrait. Her mom, vanished 18 years ago. The coffee pot hit the floor. Shards and lies exploded. He snapped it shut, face like thunder. Too late. She saw. He thinks he can buy her off, bury the secret with his billions. He's so wrong. Her quiet strength, it's a storm coming. And he has no idea. Coffee black. That's all he ever said. Booth 4, granite face, loneliness so thick you could taste it. But the day the rain turned biblical, everything twisted. I saw it, a flash of gold beneath that tailored suit when she leaned in. A heart-shaped locket, the kind your grandma owned. Except this one, it was open. Inside a tiny portrait. Her mom, vanished 18 years ago. The coffee pot hit the floor. Shards and lies exploded. He snapped it shut, face like thunder. Too late. She saw. He thinks he can buy her off, bury the secret with his billions. He's so wrong. Her quiet strength, it's a storm coming. And he has no idea. The Starlight Diner reeked of yesterday's failures and tomorrow's anxieties. Red vinyl booths, cracked and peeling, lined the walls like tired smiles. The chrome trim, once gleaming, was now dull, smeared with a million greasy fingerprints. It was a haven for forgotten dreams, a place where hope went to die a slow, greasy death. And for Clara Evans, it was both prison and sanctuary. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, she navigated the diner's narrow aisles, a blur of tired efficiency in her pale blue uniform. An artist trapped in a waitress's apron, a scholar drowning in debt. Her tiny Brooklyn apartment wasn't furnished with chairs and tables, but with stacks of second-hand art history books and butcher paper covered in charcoal sketches. Remnants of dreams deferred. Every dollar was a battlefield. Rent, instant noodles, and the ever-looming shadow of community college tuition. 24 years old, but she felt a century older. The stolen lightness of youth, taken on the day her mother, Isabella, vanished. Clara was 6. Isabella had stepped out for a gallon of milk and simply disappeared, leaving behind a void that consumed everything. All Clara had left was a single dog-eared photograph tucked away in a shoebox under her bed. It showed Isabella, luminous smile flashing, eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, leaning against a faded carousel horse, her dark hair dancing in a long-forgotten wind. That image was Clara's North Star, the painful, constant question mark that had defined her life. Her father, a good man crushed by grief, followed Isabella a few years later, succumbing to a heart attack, leaving Clara orphaned with nothing but the photo and a story that never quite made sense. "She loved you more than anything, Clara," he'd slur, his voice thick with whiskey and sorrow. The world, it was just too much for her. And then there was Booth 4. He was a fixture, 3 times a week for the past 2 months, always at 3 in the afternoon when the lunch rush subsided, and the diner settled into a weary calm. Older, late 40s maybe, with a face sculpted from granite and weathered by years of unseen storms. His suits, impeccably tailored in charcoal gray, were jarringly out of place amidst the diner's faded linoleum and sticky countertops. He sat alone, nursing a black coffee he barely touched, staring out the window at the ceaseless flow of traffic, his jaw clenched tight with unspoken tension. The other waitresses called him Mr. Blackwood, after the name on the platinum credit card he used. Clara simply called him Booth 4. He never made eye contact, never said more than coffee black, never smiled. He radiated an aura of immense power and profound, aching loneliness, a mystery she couldn't afford to solve. This Tuesday, the air crackled with impending rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the diner in stark, momentary bursts. Booth 4 sat in his usual spot, a stoic silhouette against the gray, desolate world outside. Clara approached his table, the coffee pot steaming in the cool air. Refill, sir? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a curt nod, never lifting his gaze from the window. As she leaned over to pour, her wrist brushed against his heavy ceramic mug. A slight bump, but enough to send a dark brown wave surging over the rim, staining the sleeve of his expensive suit. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Clara Ara gasped, fumbling for a napkin. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get a cloth." She anticipated anger, a dismissive gesture, the usual wall of cold silence. Instead, he finally looked at her. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, widened slightly, and a flicker of something, not annoyance, but something else entirely, flashed within their depths. "It's fine," he rumbled, his voice surprisingly low. He dabbed at his sleeve with his own napkin. And then it happened. As he moved, the front of his suit jacket fell open, revealing a gold chain around his neck, nestled against the crisp white of his shirt. Hanging from that chain, a heart-shaped locket, old, intricately engraved with swirling filigree, the kind of heirloom you'd find in a dusty antique shop. It wasn't the locket itself, though, that stole the air from her lungs. It was the fact that it was open. The clasp must have come undone with his movement, and within, on the right half of the heart, a miniature hand-painted portrait, a tiny perfect face, no bigger than her thumbnail. A young woman with a luminous smile, eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, her dark hair caught in a gentle breeze. The coffee pot slipped from Clara's grasp, crashing against the floor with a deafening shatter. Brown liquid in ceramic shards exploded across the linoleum. The few remaining customers turned to stare. Her boss, S, yelled something from the kitchen. But Clara heard nothing. Her entire world had narrowed to that tiny face in the golden heart, the face from the photograph, the face she saw reflected in her own mirror every single day, the face she hadn't seen in person for 18 years. Her voice, a choked, disbelieving whisper, barely audible over the drumming rain. That's my mom." The world stopped. The clatter of broken pottery echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence. Alistair Blackwood froze, his hand hovering over the locket. His gaze snapped from the spreading pool of coffee on the floor up to Clara's face. Her eyes, wide with shock and brimming with unshed tears, were fixed on the locket nestled against his chest. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice stripped of its usual authority, replaced by a raw, brittle edge. Clara Ara's hand trembled as she pointed. Words failed her. All she could do was stare at the impossible image, the face of Isabella Evans, younger and impossibly vibrant, smiling out from a piece of jewelry worn by a complete stranger. "My mother," she finally managed, her voice cracking. "The woman in your locket, that's my mother." Alistair's expression cycled through a storm of emotions in a heartbeat. Confusion, disbelief, and then, like a steel door slamming shut, a cold, hard denial. He quickly snapped the locket closed, the click unnaturally loud in the silent diner. He tucked it back under his shirt, a gesture that was both protective and dismissive. "That's impossible," he stated flatly. "You're mistaken." "No," Clara Ara insisted, taking a half step forward, oblivious to the shards of ceramic at her feet. "I'm not. Her name is Isabella. I have a picture, her only picture." The mention of the name Isabella struck him like a physical blow. A flicker of profound pain crossed his features before being ruthlessly suppressed. He rose from the booth, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a thick wad of bills and threw it onto the table, far more than enough to cover the coffee and the damage. "Clean this up," he ordered, his voice a low command meant for S, who was now rushing out from the kitchen. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were locked on Clara. They held a look of such deep, wounded anger that it made her flinch. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the diner, the small bell over the door jangling furiously as he pushed it open and disappeared into the rain-swept street. Clara stood motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The wad of cash on the table, the mess on the floor, the curious stares of the other patrons. It was all just noise. The only thing that was real was the after-image of her mother's face nestled in gold against the heart of a cold, mysterious billionaire. "Clara, what in God's name happened?" His gruff voice broke through her trance. He was a stout man with a kind heart, buried under a layer of grease and grumpiness. He put a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I did, S," she whispered, sinking onto the edge of the opposite booth, her legs suddenly unable to support her. That night, sleep was a stranger. Clara Ara lay in her small bed, the sounds of the city muted by the storm, and stared at the ceiling. The questions circled her like vultures. Who was that man? Why did he have a picture of her mother? Why did he react with such anger? The story her father had told her, that her mother had just walked away, overwhelmed by life, had always felt hollow, an incomplete truth. Now it felt like a deliberate lie. The next morning, driven by a desperate need for answers, Clara Ara made a decision. She wasn't just going to let it go. This was the first lead, the first crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded her mother's disappearance for 18 years. She called S and told him she was sick, a lie that sat uncomfortably on her tongue. Then she turned to the only tool she had, her outdated, slow-as-molasses laptop. She typed the one name she knew into the search bar, Alistair Blackwood. The results flooded the screen, and Clara Ara felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. This wasn't just some wealthy businessman. Alistair Blackwood was the CEO of Blackwood Holdings, a colossal real estate development firm that owned half of Manhattan's skyline. There were articles in Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, profiles of a ruthless, visionary tycoon who had inherited a family empire and multiplied its worth tenfold. He was described as intensely private, reclusive, and a widower. The articles mentioned his late wife, a socialite named Catherine, who had died in a boating accident 5 years ago. They had no children. There was no mention of a woman named Isabella, not a single word. Clara Ara scrolled through dozens of images. A Lister at charity galas. A Lister cutting ribbons on new skyscrapers. A Lister with politicians and celebrities. In every single photo, he wore the same guarded, unsmiling expression she had seen in the diner. He was a fortress, but fortresses had gates. His company, Blackwood Holdings, was headquartered in a gleaming tower of glass and steel in Midtown Manhattan, a world away from her Brooklyn diner, a place she had no business being. Clara Ara looked at the faded photograph of her mother that she had taken from its shoebox. Isabella's smiling eyes seemed to encourage her. For 18 years, she had been a ghost, a question mark, a source of pain. Now she was a possibility, a mystery to be solved. Clara Ara put on her only decent blazer, a threadbare find from a thrift store, pulled her hair back into a severe bun, and slipped the photograph of her mother into her purse. She took a deep breath, her reflection in the cracked mirror looking back at her. A scared young woman with her mother's eyes that were, for the first time in a long time, filled not with sorrow, but with fire. She was going to the fortress, and she was going to get answers. The lobby of Blackwood Holdings was designed to intimidate. The floors were polished Italian marble that reflected the cold, recessed lighting from a ceiling 3 stories high. The air smelled of money and lemon-scented cleaner. A massive, abstract sculpture of twisted bronze dominated the center of the space, and the silence was broken only by the hushed clicks of expensive shoes and the whisper-quiet hum of the building's climate control. It wasn't just a building, it was a declaration of power. Clara Ara felt her cheap blazer shrink on her shoulders. She approached the front desk, a monolithic slab of black granite manned by a receptionist who looked more like a model, her expression a carefully curated blend of boredom and disdain. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice as crisp and cool as the air around them. "Yes," Clara Ara said, trying to keep her own voice from trembling. "I'm here to see Mr. Alistair Blackwood." The receptionist didn't even bother to look at a computer screen. She simply raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I don't, but it's a personal matter. It's extremely urgent." "Mr. Blackwood doesn't take unscheduled appointments. If you'd like, you can leave a message with his executive assistant." "No, you don't understand. I need to see him. If you could just tell him it's Clara Ara Evans from the Starlight Diner." A flicker of amusement crossed the receptionist's face before it was smoothed away. The idea was clearly ludicrous to her. A waitress from a diner demanding to see the king in his castle. "I'm sorry, that's not possible," she said, her tone final. She had already dismissed Clara, her eyes drifting to a blinking light on her console. Frustration and a surge of righteous anger burned in Clara's chest. She wouldn't be dismissed, not after coming this far. "Please," she insisted, her voice rising slightly, "just give him my name. I promise you he'll want to see me." Her raised voice attracted the attention of a security guard, a large man in a sharp suit with an earpiece, who began to move purposefully toward the desk. The situation was escalating, and Clara knew she was losing. Just then, a man in an impeccably tailored suit emerged from a corridor behind the desk. He was younger than Alistair, with sharp features and intelligent, assessing eyes. He exuded an air of quiet, ruthless competence. "Is there a problem here, Jessica?" he asked the receptionist, his voice smooth and controlled. "This woman is demanding to see Mr. Blackwood without an appointment," Jessica replied, her relief palpable. "Mr. Thorne," Jessica replied, her relief palpable. Mr. Thorne's gaze fell on Clara. He studied her for a moment, taking in the thrift store blazer, the determined set of her jaw, and the desperation in her eyes. This was Marcus Thorne, Alistair's chief of staff, a man known in the business world as the gatekeeper. "I am Marcus Thorne, Mr. Blackwood's assistant," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Perhaps I can help you?" "I need to speak with him," Clara repeated, holding her ground. "It's about a locket. It's about a woman named Isabella." At the mention of the name, Marcus Thorne's professional mask didn't slip, but Clara saw a subtle tightening around his eyes. He knew. He knew who she was talking about. "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood is in back-to-back meetings for the remainder of the day," he said, the lie effortless. "If you leave your contact information, I will see that he gets the message." It was a brush-off, expertly delivered. Clara felt a wave of despair. She had been so naive to think she could just walk in here. To them, she was a nuisance, a loose thread to be snipped. She played her only card. She reached into her purse, her fingers closing around the worn edges of the photograph. She pulled it out and slid it across the cold granite desk toward him. "Show him this," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Please, just show him this picture. If he still won't see me after that, I'll leave, and I'll never come back." Marcus Thorne glanced down at the faded color photograph. He saw the smiling young woman against the carousel horse. His gaze lingered for a second longer than necessary. He picked it up carefully, as if handling a fragile piece of evidence. "Wait here," he said, his expression unreadable. He turned and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Clara alone in the vast, intimidating lobby, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The security guard watched her with hawk-like intensity. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. She was on the verge of giving up, of turning and fleeing back to the familiar, greasy comfort of the diner, when Marcus Thorne reappeared. "Mr. Blackwood will see you," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Follow me." He led her through a series of pristine white corridors to a private elevator. They rode up in silence, the only sound the soft whoosh of their ascent. The doors opened directly into a vast corner office that seemed to float above the city. 3 of the walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of Manhattan. The 4th wall was lined with books. The desk was a massive piece of dark, polished wood, empty except for a sleek laptop and a single-frame photograph turned away from view. Alistair Blackwood stood by the window, his back to her, looking down at the city he owned. He didn't turn when she entered. "Thorne, leave us," he commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. Marcus gave Clara a brief, unreadable glance and then retreated, the elevator doors closing with a soft hiss, sealing her inside the lion's den. Clara's throat was dry. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling small and out of place. Finally, Alistair turned to face her. His expression was harder than she had ever seen it. In his hand, he held the locket. "You have 5 minutes to explain why you forced your way into my office and what this absurd claim is about," he said, his voice as cold as the glass surrounding them. "Then you will leave and never mention this again to anyone." The air in the office was thick with tension. Claramara's initial fear warred with a stubborn resolve. She would not be intimidated, not now. "It's not an absurd claim," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "The woman in your locket is my mother, Isabella Evans. She disappeared 18 years ago when I was 6. I've spent my whole life wondering what happened to her. And then yesterday I saw her face around your neck. You have to tell me how you knew her." Alistair walked slowly from the window to his desk, his movements deliberate and controlled. He placed the locket on the polished wood with a soft click. He didn't look at Clara, but at some distant point beyond the glass walls, a point deep in his own past. "Her name wasn't Evans," he said, his voice low and laced with an ancient pain. "It was Rossi, Isabella Rossi." Clara frowned. "No, that's not right. My name is Evans. My father—" "Your father?" Alistair interrupted, a bitter, humorous smile touching his lips for a second. "Let me tell you about Isabella Rossi." He finally met her gaze, and his blue eyes were like shards of ice. "I met her in college. She was studying literature. I was studying architecture. She wasn't like anyone I had ever known. The women in my world were polished. They were groomed for advantageous marriages. Isabella was real. She was brilliant, passionate, funny. She painted terrible watercolors and quoted poetry and believed she could change the world. She saw me not as a Blackwood heir, but just as Allie." He picked up the locket, his thumb stroking the engraved surface. "We were inseparable for 2 years. We were going to get married. I gave her this locket for our 2nd anniversary. This office, this entire empire, it meant nothing compared to her. My family, particularly my grandmother, disapproved. She was a scholarship student, the daughter of an Italian baker from Queens. To them, she was a gold digger, an unacceptable match." He paused, the silence in the room heavy with unspoken words. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. Her mother, a literature student, in love with a billionaire. This was a fairy tale, a life so completely alien to the fragmented stories her father had told her. "We didn't care," Alistair continued, his voice softer now, lost in the memory. "We made plans to run away, to go to Europe, where I could work for a small firm and she could write. We were going to leave all of this behind." He gestured vaguely at the opulent office. The city sprawled beneath them. "And then, one day, she was gone." His voice hardened again, the pain sharpening into a blade of anger. "No note, no phone call. Her dorm room was cleaned out. Her friends said she dropped out of school and left town. She just vanished. I spent months looking for her. I hired private investigators. It was like she had ceased to exist. The only conclusion I could come to was that she'd left me, that our love wasn't enough, that my family's money and power, the very things we were going to escape, had either scared her off or worse, that she had taken a payoff from my grandmother to disappear." He looked directly at Clara, his eyes searching her face, her features, looking for something he couldn't name. "That belief, it broke something in me. It made me who I am today. Cold, distrustful. I poured all of that anger, that betrayal into this company. I built it into an untouchable fortress so that no one could ever hurt me like that again." He fell silent. The story hung between them, a tragic, beautiful, and ugly thing. Clara's heart ached, not just for herself, but for the young man he had been, and for her mother. I don't understand," Clara stammered. "My father, Daniel Evans, he told me he met her when she was waitressing. He said she was lost, that she had no family. They fell in love, they had me, and then she left. He always said she was fragile, that the world was too much for her." "Evans," Alistair repeated the name, tasting it. "So that's what happened. She ran away and created a new life, a new name, a new family." The implication was clear. In his version of the story, her entire existence was proof of Isabella's ultimate betrayal. He saw Clara not as a daughter searching for her mother, but as the living embodiment of the lie that had ruined his life. Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Could it be true? Could her mother have simply abandoned this man she supposedly loved, created a new life, and then abandoned, That one too? The thought was a poison seeping into the idealized image of the mother she had cherished for so long. But something was wrong. It didn't feel right. The woman Alistair described, passionate, brilliant, fearless, didn't sound like the fragile, broken person her father had described, and neither of them sounded like a woman who would abandon her 6-year-old child without a trace. No, Clara Ara said, shaking her head. That can't be the whole story. She wouldn't have left me. I know she wouldn't have. Alistair let out a short, harsh laugh. You believe that? Because you have to. I used to believe things about her, too. Your presence here is proof that I was a fool. He turned away from her, presenting his back once more in a clear act of dismissal. Now you have your answer. My story with Isabella Rossi ended 25 years ago. It has nothing to do with you. Thorne will see you out. He pressed a button on his desk intercom. But Clara Ara didn't move. A new fierce energy was surging through her. He had given her pieces of the puzzle, but they were sharp, and they didn't fit. Because you have to. I used to believe things about her, too. Your presence here is proof that I was a fool. He turned away from her, presenting his back once more in a clear act of dismissal. Now you have your answer. My story with Isabella Rossi ended 25 years ago. It has nothing to do with you. Thorne will see you out. He pressed a button on his desk intercom, but Clara Ara didn't move. A new fierce energy was surging through her. He had given her pieces of the puzzle, but they were sharp and they didn't fit. You're wrong, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. You hired investigators. Then you have more money and power than God now. If you really loved her, if any part of you still cares about the truth, you'll help me find out what really happened. Because someone in this story is lying. Alistair turned slowly, a dangerous glint in his eye. But behind the anger, Clara Ara saw something else. A flicker of doubt, a crack in the fortress walls. Her words had hit a nerve, disturbing a wound that had never truly healed. The comfortable narrative of betrayal he had lived with for 25 years was now being challenged by the undeniable existence of her mother's daughter standing right in front of him. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the whisper of the ventilation system. Alistair stared at Clara Ara, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The rage was still there, a simmering furnace beneath the surface, but her defiant words had stoked something else, a sliver of the same desperate hope he had crushed within himself a quarter of a century ago. The past is dead, he said, but his voice lacked the finality he intended. Is it? Clara Ara challenged, taking another step forward. You wear her picture around your neck every single day. That doesn't look dead to me. That looks like a ghost you've never been able to bury. Her words hit their mark. He instinctively touched his chest where the locket now lay hidden beneath his shirt. He had worn it every day since Isabella disappeared. A secret penance, a constant reminder of his pain and betrayal. He thought it was his armor. Maybe it was just his cage. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice raw. The truth, she replied simply. You think she betrayed you? I refuse to believe she abandoned me. Neither of those can be the whole story. You have resources. I have a need to know. Help me. Alistair sank into his large leather chair, the fight suddenly draining out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. He looked at Clara Ara, at her determined jaw, her threadbare blazer, and most of all, at her eyes. They were Isabella's eyes. Looking at her was like looking at a ghost. Thorne, he said into the intercom, his voice heavy, cancel my afternoon. He released the button and looked at Clara. I will make one call. I will have my security team run a background check on Daniel Evans and see if there are any records of Isabella Rossi after the spring of 1999. Do not expect anything to come of it. When it leads to a dead end, you will accept it and you will leave me in peace. Is that understood? Yes, Clara said, her heart leaping with a fragile hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next 2 days, Clara lived in a state of suspended animation. She went to work at the diner, her body going through the motions of refilling coffee and wiping down tables. But her mind was miles away in that glass tower waiting. Not noticed her distraction, but didn't press, merely giving her shoulder a supportive squeeze when he walked by. On the 3rd day, her phone buzzed. The caller ID was blocked. Hello, it's Alistair Blackwood. Be at my office in an hour. The line went dead. Clara Ara's hands were shaking as she rode the elevator back up to the penthouse office. This time, Marcus Thorne led her not to the main office, but to a smaller adjacent conference room. The glass table was covered in files and printouts. Alistair was standing at the head of the table, his suit jacket off his tie loosened. He looked like he hadn't slept. We found things, he said without preamble, his tone grim. Daniel Evans, a construction worker, no criminal record, died of a massive coronary 12 years ago. He and a woman matching Isabella's description lived a quiet, transient life. They moved every couple of years, always renting, always paying in cash. See, Clara Ara said she was hiding. From me, perhaps, Alistair counted. But that's not the most interesting part. He pushed a bank statement across the table. This is from an account that belonged to my grandmother, Elena Blackwood. We accessed it through the family's archival estate records. He pointed to a line item dated April 12, 1899, around the time Isabella disappeared. It was a wire transfer for $250,000 to an untraceable shell corporation. That amount of money back then. It's a fortune. Alistair murmured more to himself than to Clara Ara. I always suspected she had a hand in it, but I could never prove it. She denied it to her dying day. Your grandmother paid her to leave, Clara Ara asked, her voice filled with disbelief. It was the scenario Alistair had feared, the one that painted her mother as a gold digger. It's what I forced myself to believe, Alistair said, his gaze distant. But Thorne kept digging. He nodded at Marcus, who stepped forward and placed another document on the table. It was a copy of a hospital admission form from a small private clinic in Connecticut, also dated from the spring of 1999. The patient's name was listed as Jane Doe, but the description matched Isabella. The reason for admission, exhaustion, and monitoring. The emergency contact listed was Elena Blackwood. She was at a clinic, Clara asked, confused. A discreet one, Marcus supplied. One known for helping wealthy families deal with delicate situations. We cross-referenced the dates. The transfer of funds happened 2 days after she was admitted. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far darker than simple betrayal. Isabella hadn't just taken the money and run. She had been taken somewhere. Held. My grandmother was a formidable woman, Alistair said, his voice a low growl. She ruled this family and its business with an iron fist. She saw Isabella as a threat to the Blackwood legacy. I thought her disapproval was just snobbery. I never imagined. He trailed off, picking up another file. His knuckles were white. There's one more thing, he said, his voice strained. Thorne found a nurse who used to work at that clinic. She's retired now, living in Florida. For a price, her memory became clearer. He opened the file. Inside was a sworn affidavit. Clara Ara's eyes scanned the page, her breath catching in her throat. The nurse testified that she remembered the beautiful, sad young woman brought in by the imperious old lady. She remembered that the patient was distraught, crying that she had to get back to the man she loved. She also remembered the reason for the monitoring. The clinic had run a blood test upon her admission. The young woman, Isabella Rossi, had been 6 weeks pregnant. The affidavit slipped from Clara's fingers. The room tilted. Pregnant. Her mother had been pregnant when she disappeared. Alistair stood as if he'd been turned to stone, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the document. He slowly did the math in his head. The dates, the timelines disappeared in the spring of 1999. A baby born roughly 8 months later, a young woman named Clara Ara, who was now 24 years old. He looked up from the paper, his gaze locking with Clara's. The ice in his eyes shattered, replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding. The anger, the betrayal, the years of bitterness. It all dissolved in a flood of gut-wrenching realization. He wasn't just looking at the daughter of his lost love. He was looking at his own child. The revelation hung in the air, a stunning, impossible truth that sucked all the oxygen from the room. Clara Ara's mind raced trying to connect the dots. Pregnant. Her mother was pregnant with his child. She was his child. The thought was so monumental, so reality-altering that she felt a wave of dizziness and grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. Alistair made a choked sound, a strangled gasp of pain and disbelief. The fortress he had built around his heart for 25 years didn't just crack. It was obliterated in an instant. The carefully constructed narrative of a woman who betrayed him was replaced by a far more monstrous truth. A woman who was stolen from him, a pregnant woman forced into exile by his own family, a daughter he never knew he had. No, he whispered, shaking his head as if to deny the evidence in front of him. It can't be, but it could. It was the only thing that made sense. The secrecy, the running, the cash payments, the new name. Isabella wasn't hiding from a jilted lover. She was hiding from a powerful, ruthless matriarch to protect her child, her daughter. My grandmother, Alistair, breathed the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Marcus Thorne, his eyes wild with a desperation Clara Ara had never seen. Get a car now. He didn't explain where they were going. He didn't need to. There was only one person who could confirm the final horrifying details of this lie. Except Elena Blackwood had been dead for a decade, but her memory, her influence lived on in the one person who had been her confidant and enforcer. Elena's sister, Alistair's great-aunt, Genevieve Blackwood, a woman nearly 95 years old, living out her days in the family's sprawling Gothic estate in the Hudson Valley. The drive upstate was a blur of tense silence. Clara Ara sat in the back of the silent, cavernous Maybach, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Her own reflection, a ghostly image superimposed over the green hills. Beside her, Alistair was a statue of coiled rage and grief. He hadn't spoken a word to her since they left the office. He kept opening and closing the locket, staring at Isabella's face, then looking at Clara Ara in the rearview mirror, his expression one of profound agony. The Blackwood estate was a relic from another era, a massive stone mansion surrounded by acres of manicured, desolate gardens. It felt cold and unwelcoming, a mausoleum of family secrets. They found Genevieve Blackwood in the solarium, a frail, bird-like woman swaddled in cashmere blankets, staring out at a rose garden that had long since withered with the coming of autumn. Her eyes, though clouded with age, were still sharp and intelligent. They widened slightly as Alistair and Clara entered. Alistair, she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. You never visit, and you've brought a guest. Her gaze settled on Clara, astute and probing. My goodness, the resemblance is uncanny. Alistair dispensed with pleasantries. Genevieve, I know about the clinic. I know about the money. I know Isabella was pregnant. I want you to tell me what Elena did. Genevieve's thin lips pressed into a firm line. For a moment it seemed she would deny everything, retreating into the fortress of family loyalty. But then she looked at Clara again, and at the raw pain on her grandnephew's face, and a lifetime of complicity seemed to crumble. Elena did what she believed was necessary, Genevieve said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. To protect this family, to protect you, Alistair, from a disastrous match. She recounted the story in a calm, dispassionate tone that made the details even more chilling. Eleanor had intercepted one of Isabella's letters to Alistair, a letter in which she ecstatically announced her pregnancy. Seeing her worst fears realized a commoner's child laying claim to the Blackwood fortune, Eleanor acted swiftly. She had Isabella picked up and taken to the clinic, cutting off all communication. She gave the girl a choice, Genevieve explained, looking at her wrinkled hands. A choice that was no choice at all. Isabella could have the baby, but she would have to disappear. Elena would provide her with a sum of money enough to live on, but she was to never contact you, never reveal the child's paternity, or Elena would use the full weight of the Blackwood name to ruin her and ensure she lost the child forever. Or she could terminate the pregnancy, and Elena would let her go free and clear. Clara let out a small, horrified gasp. She chose the child, of course, Genevieve said, a flicker of ancient respect in her eyes. She was a fighter, that one. Elena arranged everything. A new identity, Isabella Evans. A fabricated backstory. She even found a man, a widower from what I recall, Daniel Evans, who was paid a handsome sum to play the part of the husband and father to legitimize the new identity. He was to keep her moving, keep her hidden. The story her father had told her, it wasn't a lie. It was a script, a role he was paid to play. And then what happened? Alistair demanded, his voice trembling with barely controlled fury. Why did she leave Clara Ara? Why did she disappear again? Genevieve sighed a long, weary sound. The money eventually ran out. Evans, the man, grew greedy. He demanded more from Eleanor a few years later. Eleanor refused. There was an argument. According to the report from our man who was keeping tabs on them, Evans became abusive. Isabella took the child and ran from him. For a few years, she was completely off our radar. She was waitressing, moving from town to town, trying to stay ahead of both Evans, and she feared us. She paused her gaze, turning to the gray sky outside. The last report we have is from 18 years ago. Our man tracked her to a small town in Pennsylvania. Evans had found her. There was a confrontation at the cheap motel where she was staying. Neighbors heard shouting. By the time police arrived, Evans was gone, and so was Isabella. There were signs of a struggle. The little girl, you were found sleeping in the next room unharmed. The police had investigated, Genevieve explained, but with no body, and a father who claimed his unstable wife had simply run off again. The case went cold. Eleanor had ordered their surveillance to cease. As far as the Blackwood family was concerned, the problem had solved itself. The full, ugly truth was finally laid bare. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had been fighting for her, protecting her until the very end. She had run from a man who was supposed to be her protector and was ultimately the victim of his violence and greed. Alistair stood silently, his face ashen. The weight of it all, the stolen love, the lies, the violence, the daughter he never knew crashed down on him. The decades of bitterness he had harbored toward Isabella transformed into an unbearable wave of guilt and regret. He had let it happen. He had been so wrapped up in his own wounded pride that he had believed the lie let her go and left her to face the wolves alone. He turned to Clara, and his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had once looked at her with such coldness, were now overflowing. The dam broke. A deep, guttural sob tore from his throat. The titan of industry, the ruthless tycoon, crumpled. He sank to his knees on the antique Persian rug, his head in his hands, and broke down in great, heaving, racking sobs. Tears of a love lost. Tears for a life destroyed. And tears for the daughter who had been standing in front of him all along. A living testament to a truth he had refused to see. The sound of Alistair Blackwood's weeping filled the cavernous solarium. It was a raw, primal sound of a lifetime of grief, guilt, and loss erupting all at once. Clara stood frozen, watching the man who was her father. A concept so new and fragile it felt like it could break, completely fall apart. Her own tears streamed silently down her face. Tears for the mother she now understood, for the father she never knew, and for the stolen years that lay between them like a barren wasteland. Genevieve watched for a moment, then with a quiet dignity, wheeled her chair out of the room, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their family's past. Slowly, hesitantly, Clara moved toward him. She knelt on the floor in front of him, her thrift store jeans brushing against the fine wool of his trousers. She didn't know what to do, what to say. How do you comfort a man who is both a stranger and your father? She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his shaking shoulder. At her touch, he looked up. His face was ravaged by sorrow, his eyes red and swollen. Through his tears, he looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw Isabella's smile in the curve of her lips, her strength in the set of her jaw, her soul in her stormy eyes. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words ripped from his soul. "Clara, I am so sorry. I should have looked harder. I should have fought for her. I believed the worst and I let her go." "You didn't know," Clara whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "She hid it to protect me, to protect both of us. She was so strong." He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly tight, as if he were afraid she too would vanish. They stayed like that for a long time. Two strangers bound by a tragic secret, kneeling on the floor of a cold mansion, finding a strange, painful solace in their shared grief. The weeks that followed were a surreal adjustment. Alistair insisted Clara move out of her cramped apartment and into a suite of rooms in his cavernous Fifth Avenue penthouse. It was a difficult transition. Clara felt like an imposter, surrounded by art she had only ever seen in textbooks, and a quiet, sterile luxury that felt nothing like home. The Starlight Diner, with its familiar smells and sounds, seemed a world away. They talked tentatively at first, then for hours on end. Alistair told her stories of her mother as a young woman, her fierce intelligence, her infectious laugh, her dreams of being a writer. Clara Ara, in turn, told him about her quiet, lonely childhood, her love for art, and the constant nagging ache of her mother's absence. They were filling in the 18-year-old ghost that had haunted both of their lives. Alistair threw the full weight of his resources into finding out what truly happened to Isabella. His investigators reopened the cold case, tracking down the long-retired police officers, re-entering neighbors from the motel. They finally tracked down Daniel Evans, living under an assumed name in a rundown town in Nevada. He was old and sick, and when confronted with irrefutable evidence, he confessed. The argument hadn't just been about money. He'd wanted to sell Clara Ara's story, the secret love child of a Blackwood, to the tabloids. Isabella had refused. The fight had escalated. He'd struck her, and she had fallen, hitting her head. In a panic, he had buried her body in the woods and fled, taking what little money she had. The confession brought a grim closure. A proper burial was finally arranged for Isabella Rossi in a beautiful, quiet cemetery overlooking the Hudson River. Her headstone was simple, engraved with a line from a poem she loved, "And death shall have no dominion." At the funeral, it was just the two of them. Alistair, his face etched with a sorrow that would likely never leave him, and Clara standing beside him. As the final handful of earth was thrown, Alistair turned to her. "She gave up everything for you," he said, his voice quiet. "Her love, her future, her life. She did it so you could be safe, so you could live." Clara nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. I know their relationship was not a fairy tale. There was no magical moment where everything felt normal. There was awkwardness and silences, and the ever-present shadow of their shared tragedy. Alistair was clumsy in his attempts to be a father, offering to buy her anything she wanted when all she really wanted was time. Clara struggled to see him as dad instead of the intimidating billionaire from the diner, but they were trying. One evening, Alistair came into the large empty room she was using as a makeshift art studio. He watched her sketch for a while, then cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, "my foundation has a significant arts and education endowment. We could fund a full scholarship for you to any university in the world. Columbia, the Sorbonne, Oxford, wherever you want to go to study your art history." Clara looked up from her sketch pad, a real, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in weeks. It wasn't about the money or the prestige. It was that he had seen her, the real her, the artist, the scholar, the part of her that had nothing to do with being a Blackwood. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd really like that." He smiled back, a fragile, tentative expression that was still new to his face. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the golden locket. He unclasped the chain and held it out to her. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this belongs to you now." Clara took the locket, its metal warm from his skin. She opened it and looked at her mother's beautiful smiling face. For the first time, looking at it didn't bring a pang of loss. It brought a sense of peace. Her mother's story was no longer a mystery. It was a legacy of love and sacrifice. And her own story, she realized, was no longer about a past she couldn't understand. It was about a future she was finally free to create with a father by her side. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be a start, a new chapter on a clean page waiting to be written. In the end, it wasn't Alistair Blackwood's fortune that gave Clara her future. It was the truth. The story of Clara and Alistair is a powerful reminder that family isn't just about blood. It's about the connections we fight for and the effort we make to heal wounds, no matter how deep. They can never get back the 18 years they lost, but they can build a future on the foundation of their mother's incredible love. A love that crossed class, divides, defied a powerful family, and ultimately cost her everything to protect her child. Their journey is just beginning, a quiet, tentative path toward becoming a family. If this story of heartbreak, secrets, and the incredible power of a daughter's search for truth touched your heart, Please let us know. Smash that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates a story that feels like real life. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next time we uncover a story that reminds us of the extraordinary drama hidden in ordinary lives. Thank you for listening.